to both of them. Rebecca will introduce you in just a sec. Let me just make a few announcements. So I want to remind everyone, this is the last MVZ lunch seminar of the semester, and next semester we will resume in person. So I look forward to seeing everybody back in person. Of course, if conditions change, we will adjust accordingly, but for now we're planning to resume in person. The schedule is on the website. I also want to remind everyone of the MVZ symposium in January, the week before classes start, that will take place on Monday. And so students should look at the emails that Carly has sent around and make sure to upload your talks by the deadline. Carly, do you want to say anything briefly?
No, just as a reminder, talks are due January 7th and the symposium is January 10th. So it's a Monday.
And we're looking forward to seeing everyone in person. Are there any other announcements? I just want to remind everyone, if you've traveled over Thanksgiving, the university is encouraging everyone to go and get tested. Again, the same applies if you travel over the December-January break. Please get tested when you return to campus. Okay, I'll turn it over to Becca, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, I am really excited to have Kate here for both of our talks. I've followed a lot of the conversation and social media that Kate has participated in and led in on about issues in academia, and also so issues in academia, and also her research on feminism biology, which is a really nice lens to have and to hear from. And so we're really lucky to have her. Kate got her PhD from Yale University in 2007. She's currently an associate professor at the University of Illinois Urbana, Champaign. Kate has published a lot of influential articles. She was asked to be on the committee, sorry, I'm just making sure I say this correctly, the committee, I'm sorry. So she helped author the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report of sexual harassment on women, climate, culture, and consequences in the academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. And because we're on Zoom, I would actually like to share, I'm going to put a copy of this in the chat, because if you haven't read it, you should take a look. It's a really nice summary of what sorts of sexual harassment and gender harassment exist in the in academia, and also what we can do about it. And Carly, does it not allow us to put files in here? Maybe we have some setting off. I will send it around to the department. So Kate has also won several awards. Recently, her campus awarded her with Excellence in Public Engagement Award. So as I mentioned before, I highly recommend engaging with Kate on social media if you are on social media. And she was named to the National Academy's Action Collaborative Advisory Board on Sexual Harassment in Academia. She's received the Gender Equity Award from the American Anthropology Association. And I am just thrilled to have her expertise here to share with us both today during the MVZ seminar and also tomorrow, and I'll repost the link in the Integrative Biology seminar at 12:30 is called There is No Such Thing as a Normal Menstrual Cycle, Menstrual Phenotypes, and Menstrual Changes. So Kate will be talking tomorrow about her research on menstruation. And with that, the floor is yours, Kate. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind introduction and giving me a chance to talk to you all today. There we go, just queuing up my notes. So I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. I acknowledge these nations and others past and present and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who stewarded it throughout the generations. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the specific growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the often harmful role that this university has played in shaping them. In the ways that I will be discussing the colonial and white supremacist origins of modern scientific practice, I will be invoking, acknowledging, and I hope working to repair at least some of these harms. I also want to provide a content warning. I will not describe graphic accounts of sexual forms of harassment or sexual assault, but I will describe gender harassment, and I do have a tendency to swear. I also want to start, rather than having my sort of thank you slide at the end of my talk, I like to have it at the beginning. I want to honor and acknowledge the contributions and leadership of several members of the Clancy Lab, past and present. This is a team environment where our success is shared. And I really want to be clear that much of the work that we did that I'll be talking about today was because of people who are in this picture. I'll be citing multiple projects that Michelle Rodriguez led, as well as ones that Katie Lee did substantial analyses on. But I also want to acknowledge everyone in this picture, as well as people who aren't even in this picture, for pushing me, for challenging me, for being smarter than me, for bringing a really amazing perspective to our lab. And I think our lab would not be the kind of, as we call it, intersectional feminist biology research playground that it is if we didn't have people who were willing to sort of hold each other accountable to what that means every single day. I also want to acknowledge that we have had some funders for some of this work, but I will say the majority of the work I'll be talking about today has been underfunded or unfunded. Very little of this work actually has received money. This is just stuff that I do with the scraping up the last bits of startup funds, which already were a quarter the size of the startups of my colleagues, my male colleagues, when I got started many years ago. So the AAS Committee for the Study of Women in Astronomy funded a small portion of some of the astronomy data. The National Science Foundation funded an incivility workshop that I ran in 2019. And then the University of Illinois Leadership Center also provided me with a small fellowship. And some of that work and some of that funding did absolutely allow me to do some of this work and to fund the personnel needed to do the analyses. I also want to acknowledge a number of amazing collaborators, some of whom have been and continue to be very important mentors to me, including Lilia Cortina, Anna Kirkland, Sandy Hershkovas, Christina Ritchie, Erica Rogers, Ruby Mendenhall, Carla Hunter, Jenny Avos, Aisha Boyce, Robin Nelson, Julian Rutherford, Katie Hind, Kelly Cross, and Princess Mweketa. And again, I actually take the time to really talk about this because of the fact that I might just be up here today talking to you, but I'm not up here alone. That my scholarship and the things that I present as a sole presenter would not be possible without the many collaborative, really rich collaborative relationships that I have. So I want to start with sort of the way that we think about gender and racial inequality and other forms of inequality within the sciences. It's always been strange to me that when we talk about problems of representation in academia, we use really passive language. I was a union organizer throughout my time in graduate school, and I've been arrested for civil disobedience, and I've been on strike. I've experienced substantial retaliation for the sorts of efforts that I've made towards labor organizing. I also lost a lot of union members, a lot of amazing scholars that I wish were still beside me while I was in grad school. I lost them to spiteful or lazy mentors, to a lack of childcare, to poverty wages. there wasn't a leaky pipeline in graduate school of women and men of color and white women just kind of slipping through the cracks in a pipe or pushing ineffectually at a glass ceiling. They were pushed out decisively, vindictively, with fear of what they might do to change academia and demonstrate the mediocrity of the people who held the most power. These metaphors also suggest really different fixes. If the problem is a leaky pipeline, we need to plug it up. If the problem is a glass ceiling, we need to shatter it. If it's a chilly climate, we can give women sweaters. These are the actual metaphors and the actual metaphorical solutions used to promote different types of policy and institutional responses to the underrepresentation of women and underrepresentation of people of color in science. This is why metaphors matter. But here's what goes unaddressed in these passive constructions. Who benefits from the leaky pipeline? Who upholds the glass ceiling? What are the structures formed by generations of inequality in leadership with low diversity and even lower imagination? These are the questions I want you to ask yourself today as we look at the science of sexual harassment and try to course correct around popular misconceptions and traditional institutional responses. I'm going to start with some, well, I'm going to start actually, I swapped one part of the talk and I'm taking some unpublished data and actually starting with it as a way of sort of problematizing the way we even give these talks, frankly, around sexual harassment, to talk about the ways in which the solutions to sexual harassment is not about gathering more evidence. But then I'm going to move on to some myth busting and cover 30 years of research in what I hope will be just a handful of minutes. From there, I want to address the origins and repercussions of the current incentive structures of science. And then I want to imagine what a scientific community of trust and accountability can do, one where its members dare to be transparent about mistakes and encourage multiple and compassionate paths towards success. So here's the first myth, or in terms of solutions. It is not about the evidence. We don't need more evidence. It's about what are we doing with this upholding of power structures. So I don't actually do a ton of sexual harassment research anymore. Effectively, early on in the pandemic, partly when I was just stuck at home for months with both of my children and unable to really do any work, as was the case for many people, there was a lot of soul searching that I did. And one of the things that I realized is I hit a point where I kind of hate doing this work. And I say no to the majority of talk requests on this topic, to be totally honest. I have like one more this semester and I think one next semester, and I think I've said no to pretty much everything else. And there are several reasons for it. One is that in that soul searching, I sort of hit this point that I was tired of the emotional toll that it takes to continually do this work and to present different groups of people with the same evidence and then feel like institutional responses have not changed. There are a few other things that also happened. One is that I really have come to realize, and this is something that we figured out, it's something that organizational psychologists have known for a long time. It's something that the 2018 NASM report did a great job illustrating. And it's that the findings around what causes sexual harassment and what the consequences are of sexual harassment have been replicated dozens of times across dozens of workplaces, dozens of different types of workplaces over 30 years. But everyone comes to me wanting me to help them design a climate change, some kind of climate survey or analysis or something because their institution or department or museum or lab group is special and different and they need data on their institution because somehow that will illuminate the problem differently than if they would look at the 30 years of evidence on the military, on academia, on corporations, on nonprofits, on police forces. I could go on. The research is enormous at this point. We know what causes, and I will talk about the answers to these things, but we know what causes it. We know what the consequences are. We even know, which I will get to at the end, how to fix it. And then we just look at, and then institutions get told what to do to fix it. And then they go, nah, I don't want to do that one. And then they do other stuff. So we know the answer and nobody's doing it. That's the next part, is that in a lot of ways, and I'm intentionally starting with sort of the downer sort of talk here, but I promise part of that is that I hope there's a payoff at the end, that this is not a downer of a talk all the way through, but I want to go through some of my own struggles with this because I think it's important in situating you through the rest of the talk. Institutional and disciplinary reward structures have not necessarily moved in the right direction. Yeah, a few professional societies have now created sexual harassment or code of conduct things for their conferences. A few places have now created diversity awards. You know, there are a couple of things that like are CVable that recognize efforts outside of quantity of publications and quantity of grant money. But the arms race and the way in which that is just sort of like the expectations are ever expanding of how much research we need to do to be considered good enough to be an academic, that is not actually good for reducing sexual harassment. Then we have endless policy responses, but little will to force culture or climate change. So if what you get out of this talk at the end is you just need to like tweak the policy of your department a little bit more, you will have somehow missed the words coming out of my mouth because policy is not going to save you. It's not going to save me. All policy does is actually protect the institution from liability. That's all it does. It doesn't actually make the material conditions of anybody in the workplace better. The other thing that I want to sort of front load this talk with is to think a little bit about what it means that many of us are at predominantly white institutions and still predominantly male in a lot of cases institutions. My university is not only predominantly white, it is predominantly male. It is because the University of Illinois has a very long history of being very engineering focused. And so it's not just that our faculty are majority male. I believe our student body still is as well, though I haven't checked those numbers recently. But when I first got here, it was like very strongly male, and I don't think that those numbers have changed too much. When we think about what it means that the people in power are the people with majority experiences, and then what that means when they look out into the world and see whether it is a fair world or not, people with majority experiences, especially those who are in power, mean that things like committee assignments within your department are going to seem fair to the majority of the people in the department. It means that promotions look meritocratic. It means that when someone makes a lower status or lateral move to get the heck out of your department, it's going to look like a choice that is incredibly individualistic and just has to do with that person's particular circumstances. Behaviors that differentially affect groups in the minority will instead be minimized, gaslit, or claimed to be part of, quote, what it takes to succeed. I'll give you an example from some data that we that we've analyzed, but we haven't written up yet. And this is a climate survey that we did for a large elite research institution in the United States. And so in particular, I'm just going to speak briefly to some of the racial microaggression data that we collected. So we looked at racial microaggressions, and we can sort it out by people's self-identified race. So if you look just at the frequency of individuals reporting racial microaggressions, you can see that if you identify as white, which is the vast majority of the data set, then less than 40% reported experiencing racial microaggressions. I will also add that that 40% is a very weirdly inflated number because a number of the white people who participated in this survey seemed to fill out the racial microaggression scale in a hostile way, where they selected things that it was physically impossible to be true. Like, I don't ever see anybody of my race in my workplace because this is a predominantly white institution. It is a factually impossible thing to be true. So this number is in fact inflated. And then you can see if you self-reported as Asian, Black or African-American, Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish, or in a multiracial identity, or did not feel safe actually sharing your race, you can see that the frequency reporting racial microaggressions are quite high. And in fact, just to let you know, this number up here for Black or African Americans in the sample was 91%. Put another way, this is representing everybody in the survey, where the red dots represent anyone who reported experiencing racial microaggressions, and the white dots represent not experiencing them. And so you can see if you are in the majority identity, representing the majority of the organization, the way it looks for you is pretty good. You know, you are not witnessing or personally experiencing a whole lot of racial microaggressions, whereas if you occupy a different racial identity, your lived experience is in fact quite different. And so we're talking not just about relative, but absolute differences. From this same data, another thing that we noticed is that the consequences of these behaviors So when we're looking in particular at experiences of burnouts, this is sort of the negative experience. Flow state is like sort of how much flow and how able are you to sort of dive into your work. So flow state is sort of a positive marker, and then turnover is representing someone's turnover intention. So whether or not they are looking to leave the organization. People who perceived their workplace as inclusive, you can see, you know, these sort of negative consequences were not felt because there was a negative relationship between, if the more inclusive you felt the workplace was, you know, the lower your rates of burnout, the lower rates of turnover intentions. I want to actually just spend a moment on down here, MCC. This is masculinity contest cultures. This is something that was developed by Peter Lick and Jennifer Burdall to look at sort of the highly masculine competitive atmosphere that can be present in many workplace environments. And these are the 4 different subscales, showing no weakness, strength and stamina, workaholism, and a dog-eat-dog environment. And you can see there was a positive relationship among people who experienced their workplace as one with a masculinity contest culture in multiple cases and experiences of burnout and turnover. And this is for the entire data set, but when we looked at it versus people with white identities versus non-white identities, then we saw that people's experience, you know, the MCC and inclusion markers and stuff were very different by race. So I say all of that to kind of launch into this idea of what are the myths of sexual harassment, to remind you that in some ways it doesn't matter what I say today. And again, I'm not saying that in a self-defeating way. I'm saying that I've given these talks for years now, and I've talked to people one-on-one about this for years now. And in some ways, the evidentiary base of what it means for sexual harassment to be a problem don't matter so much as whether you have in some ways, whether you have a lived experience that allows you to recognize, to have empathy and recognize that people might have experiences different from your own. Okay, so all of that said, here's the first myth. Sexual harassment, turns out it's not actually about sex. It's about sexism. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. So sexual harassment is comprised of the way social scientists tend to talk about is we talk about it in terms of come-ons and put-downs. Come-ons are unwanted sexual advances, sexual coercion. These are the things that we are very familiar with when we are looking at instances of sexual harassment on that Apple TV morning show and other similar examples, right? Like the kinds of things that when you take a Title IX training, the kinds of examples you are given is someone coming on to you, someone trying to do quid pro quo, pressuring you into sex, all of that kind of stuff. Those are come-ons. Put-downs are or also known as gender harassment, are, I think in a lot of ways, harder to pin down for people. These are crude behaviors, sexist hostility, the kinds of things that are not actually sexual, but sexist. They can have sexual elements like the crude behavior one. So for example, when I was in grad school, one of my colleagues in the chemistry department was really upset that happy hours were always advertised with very sexual images of women on the posters that were put around. So, you know, there'd be an image of like 2 women's legs on a poster, and then inside of the 2 legs were, you know, chemistry happy hour at this bar at this time, you know. And when she reported, you know, so when she said, hey, this makes me uncomfortable. I don't love walking around and seeing these sexual images of women advertising departmental specific events. You know, then the response was just, well, oh, come on, it's just meant as a joke. So that's an example of a put down. That's a crude behavior, right? So it's not directed. In this case, it wasn't directed at any one person. It was just sort of plastered all over the department. What the problem is that come-ons actually only comprise maybe 5% of the sexual harassment that actually occurs in any given workplace. And this number is pretty stable across pretty much every workplace that has been studied so far. And in fact, put-downs comprise a much greater proportion of, oh, I'm sorry, I'm actually misspoke. No, that is right. 5%, and then the rest are tend to be put-downs. So the way that we often like to think about it is that we think of sexual harassment like an iceberg. The types of harassment that are above, that are in public consciousness, what you can see are the come-ons, and the types of sexual harassment that actually are more harmful, right? If we want to add the Titanic to this metaphor, the part that you can't see, that you're going to crash into, that might actually cause you the most harm, are the things that lay below the water. I would also add that another part of this conversation that often gets missed is a conversation around what's called incivilities or rude behaviors of ambiguous intent. These behaviors seem general, right? That's why they're rude behaviors of ambiguous intent, and yet substantial research by Lilia Cortina and others has shown that these behaviors are in fact selective. So women of color are in fact in a given workplace the most likely to experience rude behaviors of ambiguous intent, followed by white women, you know, and then men of color and white men. And so even general rudeness, general hostility, when we, you know, if a person says, oh yeah, sure, our workplace, I mean, it's got some problems, but it's not so bad, and they occupy a majority identity, what they might not realize is that maybe they are witness to or see some tiny proportion of it, but they have no idea the depth and frequency and severity of how much it's happening and how much worse it might be for someone who is in a historically excluded identity. So as just one example from a paper of ours that just came out earlier this year, here's a quote from a woman of color science faculty from a number of focus groups that we ran. And she says, I have had a student challenge my method, challenge material, challenge my grading scheme. I've had a graduate student question my credentials, question my methods, ask me if I knew how to advise a project. Even I had a colleague challenge my work. And many of the women in our sample reported something similar, just relentless challenging of their worthiness of being there, right? That this was a common experience of women of color or faculty across all ranks, was just the constant questioning of whether they had the chops, whether they had the pedigree, whether they were smart enough, whether they belonged. And while all of us, regardless of identity, can probably point to at least one time in our lives where that has been something that has been directed at us or that we have felt, we need to understand that the frequency and severity is different based on the types of the sort of historical exclusion of the space in which we're working, and again, the sort of other types of power structures at play. So there's a ton of qualitative data, but then like I said, there's also multiple decades of quantitative data. In our lab, we specifically did look at and effectively confirm what had already been found everywhere else, which is that sexual harassment rates are pretty high in the workplace and that they're pretty much all come-ons. So I'll give you a couple of different examples from our lab. We looked at undergraduate female physicists based on a conference that they all typically attend, and we found that 75% of them experienced sexual harassment. If you look at this full pie chart, you'll notice 1.3% was unwanted sexual attention. So a tiny, tiny fraction was only unwanted sexual attention, and the rest of that 75% was had at least some inclusion of gender harassment or put downs. So again, the majority of the experience is this stuff that we brush off and say, oh, it's no big deal, or, you know, you're just making too much of this. You know, the things that we belittle or that we do not recognize are actual forms of harassment. Findings were really similar in the two other places that we've done this work. We've done this work looking at the field sciences in terms of frequency of sexual harassment. When you look at the sort of, when you add up the rarely, regularly, frequently, you end up with around 60 to 70%. Sorry, you end up with about 75% of women reporting sexual harassment in their time in the field. When you look at astronomy and planetary science, again, you see something similar, something around anywhere from 70 to 80% every workplace you look at. If you do it in a methodologically rigorous way, where you are not saying, where you're not asking people to define their experiences through labels, but instead through behaviors and experiences, you see these numbers over and over again. And you can see that in this case, the numbers of men reporting sexual harassment are not small. We situate this as a problem of cisgender women, when in fact, this is something that has much broader consequences for many more people, for people of color, for people with LGBTQ experiences, for genderqueer people. And so in fact, to sort of add an intersectional analysis to this and to think more about multiple lived experiences, I want to share just a little bit of additional data from the astronomy and planetary science sample from a couple of years back. In addition to the fact that we asked about harassment experiences across different types of identities, we also asked, just in the last 5 years, have you ever been made to feel unsafe in your workplace, and why? And what we found was that 40% of the women of color in our sample said that they had been made to feel unsafe in their workplace, which I hope that you sit with for a minute, because that's, when you think about it, an astronomical number, given what we were asking. Have you ever been made to feel unsafe? And almost half the sample said, yeah, I've been made to feel unsafe. And we're not talking about over the course of their entire lives or their entire careers, just in the last 5 years. which means for many of them, they were in the workplace where they had been made to feel unsafe. Those who reported being sexually harassed within this sample were also more likely to report skipping work events. We're talking about colloquia, workshops, networking events, happy hours. If your workplace is a place where you are uncomfortable because of one person or because of an entire hostile environment, you are going to engage with that workplace less, which is going to deny you substantial opportunities. I was recently talking to someone about the fact that I did not, even though I was invited multiple times to participate in something at my university, because of the person in power in that organization had effectively buried a sexual harassment claim that I made about another person there. I refused to work with that organization for about 7 years, and I missed out on grant opportunities. I missed out on collaborative opportunities. I did not have access to equipment that would have helped my career because I was not going to participate in being a part of that group. And it hurt me professionally in a really big way, but I also wasn't going to participate and be around people that, you know, were going to just like shuffle around a white man after he physically intimidated people. To again, continue to talk about multiple types of lived experiences and identities, we also looked at the experiences of LGBTQ women and gender minorities. And one of the things we found is that LGBTQ women and gender minorities are physically harassed at work at twice the rate of cis straight women. And again, this isn't some general study of workplaces. This is a study of people in astronomy and planetary science, most of whom in our sample had PhDs. So we're talking about smart people who we think are good people who are clearly not doing always good things, right? And again, one of the reasons we made this comparison against cis straight women is that it was important to us to not be accused of making some straw person argument by comparing them to, say, the least likely to experience harassment group, like say cis straight men. So we were comparing it to a group that is often held up as, oh, look at these vulnerable women who experience the worst harassment, and they do experience a lot. But then if you have an LGBTQ identity, your risk is effectively doubled. So then, like I said, I was going to tell you a little bit about the causes and not just the consequences of harassment. So I want to talk a little bit about those environmental predictors. There are two, and you can look at them in a lot of different ways, but the two biggest ones are male domination in a given workplace and tolerance for harassment. There are three ways that social scientists tend to define this term male domination. So again, just like with incivilities, with put downs versus come-ons, these are operationalized and recognized terms within organizational psychology. So this isn't me just trying to sort of like, I don't know. I get it. People have a real problem with that term of male domination, but I'm like, it's like, that's just in the literature. That's just, I'm expressing something from the literature. So the three terms are, or the three conditions, and any one of these can be met to be considered to be a male-dominated workplace. You can have more men than women, more men in leadership, or it can be a historically male job. Only one of those conditions needs to be met for a workplace to be considered to be male-dominated. Any one of those single factors increases the risk of sexual harassment in a given workplace. The other thing we know is that, like I said, tolerance for sexual harassment is the other major factor to consider. And tolerance of harassment can be any one of these conditions. It can be that an organization fails to take complaints seriously, that they fail to sanction perpetrators, or that they fail to protect complainants from retaliation. So given that we know, actually, these are the kinds of things that predict harassment, I want to now talk a little bit about what the other end of it, sort of the consequences. So remember, I talked about incivility earlier. And so I want to invoke that again in this conversation. So this is, I'm going to share with you just one of two different slides that I could from this paper by Lim and Cortina from 2005 that looked at these aggregate measures of job-related outcomes as well as personal outcomes based on the kinds of experiences people had in the workplace. So people who had no incivility or gender harassment or sexual harassment experiences, look where they are up here. Isn't that so lovely to have like no problematic outcomes? Your job-related outcomes are wonderful. This was an aggregate that was about like turnover intentions, burnout, some of the things I was talking about before. You add in just incivility, rude behaviors of ambiguous intent, which I've told you are present more for women of color than for any other group, and yet are general. So it is very hard to go to a Title IX office and say, you know, people are doing this to me or saying this to me, or I can collect these 10 different stories, but I can't really point to like one time people said that's like, said this to me because of your race or because of your gender, right? You can't specifically point it to being racialized, gendered, or about sexual identity or anything. And look at the major drop that you see in job-related outcomes just with the thing that we think is not a big deal. Then you add in gender harassment, people experience incivility and gender harassment. Then you add in sexualized harassment and you see even further worsening. And again, just for time's sake, I'm not showing both slides, but the personal outcomes in terms of health, anxiety, depression, you see basically the same sort of curve in terms of types of things that have strong consequences. Part of the reason this is the case is that is not to make light of what we see as very severe acts of sexual coercion and to say that those should not be taken seriously. The issue is that because they are the only kinds that tend to be taken seriously, it is easier for a person who's being targeted by sexual coercion or unwanted sexual advances to understand that it is not about them and to externalize the harm than it is when you are being consistently just chipped away at all day long. So the low level frequent, there's research now to suggest across multiple meta-analyses of these 30 years of data I pointed at, that the low level, high frequency, just chipping away behaviors are actually more harmful than the one big event. We should of course be stopping all of them. That's not me trying to do some kind of comparative suffering thing exactly, but I do just want to make clear that what we think of as the worst experiences, while of course worse in certain ways, in terms of the outcomes and consequences are not actually the same. Another way to think about this is we have a paper that just came out, Lilia Cortina, Sandy Hershkovich, and I, also earlier this year, that thinks a little bit about the types of sort of biobehavioral responses to acts of incivility and by extension, I would say a lot of low-level harassment behaviors. So I just want to walk you through this really quickly. So we've got an act of incivility. So we talked about it around incivilities, but again, any negative workplace behavior applies. We've got the target appraising the uncivil act. Like, is this a person with more power than me, less power than me? Is this the 10th time they've done it, the first time they've done it? And that is going to affect their biological response. Like, it's going to affect the extent to which their HPA axis is upregulated, right? But then the other thing that's going to happen is their biological response will be further affected by their own behavioral response. So in a masculinity contest culture, for instance, it's going to be pretty hard for somebody to very readily find a way to make amends with someone being rude, or find a way to sort of gently call in and say, hey, you know, this is like the 5th time you've left me off this email. I would really like to just talk to you about why that is, right? Depending on your work environment and depending on your own identity, you might not have the ability to sort of come up with a way to sort of make amends and create sort of a social support kind of environment, or to vent to somebody and find a way to sort of make things better. And so if that's the case, say you're a woman of color and you can't afford to act in certain ways because you are so constrained in the ways you have to ask, or you're in a bro environment and you just can't, if you don't act like a bro at all times, you're going to get punished for it. That's going to in turn affect your biological response more. If you were able to make amends, if you were able to gently call in, if you're able to resolve the situation, it's going to allow you to downregulate your HPA axis, right? And if not, it's going to further upregulate you. So there's sort of like a 2-step process. The person who's targeted, and then of course has consequences for their health. Okay, next myth is that we just need to come up with like fast fixes. There's just lots of little things we can do. What's the, you know, I remember the first conversation I had with somebody on my campus who brought me in to like get my insight on how to fix sexual harassment. And his question to me was, what's the low hanging fruit here? And I was like, there's no low hanging fruit. It's like, you gotta blow it up. I'm sorry, but that's the answer. They don't allow for community engagement and buy-in. Fast fixes don't allow an organization to even assess, right? To conduct appropriate evaluations to see if they're even ready for change. And that's the thing you can do. There's a whole readiness for change literature. What you need is sustained engagement and a willingness to completely change the incentive structures upon which your department and your discipline have been built. So let's think about which of these two things kind of changes lives. We've got culture, which is what an organization says. This is the most like pie in the sky, and I mean this in a good way. This is the most pie in the sky, big picture. Here's what we believe in. Here's what we stand for. And we believe this about ourselves. And it could be aspirational, right? Your mission statement, your policy, your trainings. And then climate is how everyone actually feels. So it's how culture trickles down into the day-to-day lived experience of being at that workplace. So it's the incentive and reward structures, it's the condoned behaviors, it's kind of the unwritten rules. So I'll give you an example. Many universities, I'm sure yours included, says somewhere on their website how much they deeply care about teaching, research, and service, right? We care about all of these things. I'm curious how many of you, I'm giving a National Institute of Health example here, but I'm sure that you can give these examples across different types of funding structures. Then there's what happens to an assistant professor when they roll in. And if someone's kind enough to read them in, puts their arm around them, or at least in pre-pandemic days, put their arm around them and said, listen, I know that your contract says like you care about teaching, research, and service, and here are the percentages you're supposed to work. Everyone knows you need to get an R01 and be barely passable at teaching to actually get tenure here, right? That's the unwritten rules. That's the incentive structures, right? Is that we know that's what you have to do. Even if that goes against your own reasons for being a professor, that's how you have success. Yikes. What that means is that policies to address sexual harassment barely address the tip of the iceberg. So we've got, for instance, if we look again, just at the things above public consciousness, right? Unwanted sexual advances and sexual coercion, the types of policies one would come up with, if we only think about sexual harassment in terms of the ways in which it's sexual, would be, oh, let's have a Title IX compliance officer to make sure we're complying with the law. Let's have a code of conduct that tells people don't harass. Let's have sexual harassment training that also tells people also don't harass. And then we have mandatory reporting, which is the second you try to talk to anybody about any of this stuff, we have to report it formally so that we make sure that we're being compliant and that we think about legal liability of the institution, right? There is ample evidence showing that every single one of these policy solutions has a neutral or even negative effect on the incidence of sexual harassment at institutions. And that's because most policy solutions focus on these statutory violations. The risks of reporting in particular, which all of these in different ways rely on, are substantial. A recent EEOC report showed that 75% of complainants face some sort of retaliation, which means only the most obvious of cases against the worst, assaulters ever gets reported. I'll just tell you, I mean, not privately because it's a public talk, but I'll just say I have been involved in a number of Title IX cases or been sort of read in or supported people through a number of Title IX cases. The only ones I've seen that have been investigated and found in favor of the victim are when the abuser is a man of color. So this is not a fair system. The white male abusers I've seen have not actually ever faced justice. I mean, I'm talking about a very small sample. This is anecdotal, but it's an observation I've made that it's been hard to escape. I'll give you an example. The University of Illinois, even though there's many reasons I love it, we have had a bit of an ethics issue. You may have seen us in the news over the last 10 years for clout lists and other types of unsavory behaviors. And those are all done by upper administrators. And yet, because upper administrators have misbehaved ethically, we now all have a yearly ethics training that we have to take. And mainly what the ethics training does is tells us how to snitch on our colleagues for, I don't know, buying too many pens with the wrong fund. One of the things that I found really troubling is that they made sure to say, we really support you if you are being retaliated against, but then they made sure to only define one type of retaliation, and it's called professional retaliation. So if you experience reprimand, discharge, demotion, or a change in the terms of or conditions of your work, to them, that counts as professional retaliation, and that's bad, and they'll help you with that. But they will not help you with social retaliation. People no longer working with you, people not talking to you anymore, people turning their shoulder, people, maybe giving you less access to things that you need, but not exactly ever saying why, or just kind of slow walking stuff to you when you need it, right? Social retaliation is a much larger problem, just like gender harassment is much bigger than sexual forms of harassment, and yet workplaces do not do anything to protect you from it. So finally, one last thing about reporting. Again, like I've said, we have decades of research on this, and because we have decades of research on sexual harassment, that also means we have decades of research, of intervention research, of people trying to do stuff about it, okay? So I want to share with you some research from 1996. This was looking at incidences of sexual harassment in a large public university, cough, cough, in the Midwest, cough, cough. by Louise Fitzgerald, who is she's one of the authors of this, and she is one of the first people to actually really systemically look at sexual harassment. And she was formerly at the University of Illinois. She's now emeritus. And what you can see is the way these studies work. You do a climate survey where, like you get a somewhat random response from the university of people responding and saying, has this behavior happened to you, right? Not have you been sexually harassed, but like defining them and seeing the extent to which people say, yes, that's happened to me. And then they compare that to the percent of actual formal reports that the institution gets. So in this case, you can see only 6% of the actual incidences documented in the climate survey were represented in any type of formal reporting, but this was back in 1996. And since then, we've been all working really hard, right? We've been trying to improve reporting structures. We've been trying, we have now all these rules about mandatory reporting. So really, reporting should be way better now, right? Here's an example from 2016, so 20 years later. This is a study of sexually harassed grad students within a large public university in the Midwest. Formal reporting was 6.4%. No report, 93.6%. This is just 2 examples that I'm giving you. I could give you more. It's the same, it's 5 to 6% is the formal reporting number across pretty much every workplace where this has ever been studied. Reporting is not the answer. And the reason people don't report is that they have a fear of blame, disbelief, inaction, retaliation, humiliation, ostracism, a damage to one's career or income. There's also a widespread belief that reporting is only for the most egregious acts. It's not that reporting mechanisms are not necessary. The reason I'm problematizing them is not saying we should get rid of them. I'm problematizing them because they are insufficient to solve this problem. So a consequence to sort of a compliance-based or a legal framing is that when we only think of things in terms of policy solutions, culture solutions, let's just hire more people in this compliance office, is that it makes universities effectively risk averse when it comes to resolving complaints. There is a lot of research now that shows, Nancy Cantalupo is one of the folks, and Thomas Kidder have a couple of great papers on this, that shows how it is in the universities, if I'm remembering their data correctly, I hope I'm not confusing this with a different paper now as I'm thinking about it, but I will say in the literature, there is pretty good evidence at this point that for the most part, universities are going to find in favor of the person, of the alleged abuser, as opposed to the complainant. And that's because it is financially in their best interest, because for a very long time, the assumption has been that the alleged abuser is more litigious and more likely to sue if the findings don't go their way. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Abusers 90% of the time are male. The majority of the time we're talking about a power differential, so they have more power. And of course, by creating a legal formal structure to have a conversation about this human problem, and especially because sometimes these are not just like severe, overt, obvious things, though also in those cases, you are creating a condition where now they feel like their character is being called into question and they are going to retaliate with legal action. Universities are terrified of being are being sued by alleged abusers. And so, if it just so happens that they're the ones that are typically found in favor of, it kind of makes sense, right? These formal procedures also filter who reports. We have at our university a very easy reporting system, which I do appreciate, that anyone can fill out. And if you fill it out on behalf of somebody because you're mandatory reporting, they are really good about following up with that person. And if that person doesn't want to talk, they drop it. They don't, unless they think there's a danger to others, they don't force you to go through the reporting process. So, there are definitely ways in which people can make these procedures more humane. It still doesn't change the fact that it's still going to filter who ends up reporting. The other issue is that, like I said, with this, you can go to somebody and say, would you like to report? Or, hey, I've had to report on your behalf as a mandatory reporter. Would you like to follow up? When we make everything about you have to follow the reporting process and the reporting structure, it means that action can only be taken if a victim is willing to come forward. And if someone's not willing to come forward, which has been the case, we have a high profile case in my department where, some people did come forward. The investigations were never found in their favor. Many, many, many more people had experiences, but could not come forward or did not feel comfortable coming forward, which meant that even though people wanted to do something about this individual, they felt powerless to do so. Because when we only imagine things as this is how you solve it, we can't imagine a way to move forward, even when we know there's a problem, without that report, right? So here's the thing, instead of this legal framing, instead of feeling so completely stuck that this reporting process is the only way we can solve these problems, especially when we back up and remember that the iceberg, the majority of what's happening below the surface are things that people aren't even going to report anyway. Let's see if we can think about different ways to actually solve this. And the main thing we need to do is we need brave leadership. I know I started this talk with why I don't do a lot of this research anymore, and that starting there meant I ran the risk of sort of framing things as hopeless. It's not that it's hopeless. It's that we have a lot of the answers already about how to solve issues of harassment. We don't need to collect more data per se, right, in the way that many of us want to. And the question now is whether we are going to hold our leaders accountable and make them be brave, and whether we're going to do that too. I recently was having a conversation with a colleague where I learned, in a way that was completely unsurprising, that I am sometimes viewed as tough, because when I'm in meetings, I hold people accountable to whatever it is we're supposed to be doing. And that's a way that I'm perceived as perhaps difficult, right? I know loads of men who are difficult because they're rude and hostile and jerks and pull rank all the time. None of them get whispered about, right, for being tough or for holding people accountable. But a woman who says, hey, maybe we should consider issues of sexual harassment or gender inequality or racial inequality, she's going to get that label. And I'm telling you that if we want to change things, we all got to adopt that label. You have to be the one in the room that's like, oh my gosh, we're on this committee with Becca. She is going to hold us accountable to the call for this committee, isn't she? We're actually going to have to do it the way we were told to do it. Like, oh, we actually have to do the affirmative action training for this hiring committee, and oh, we actually have to take it seriously. Or not to put you, I'm now speaking more generally, I'm not putting you on the out on blast here, but anyone, like every single one of us has to decide, oh, I'm going to be that Kate Clancy accountability jerk. Like, that's actually what we need, is who is going to actually hold these systems accountable. And if they refuse to be held accountable, as has been the conversation in anthropology over the last couple of years, sometimes you need to let it burn. Sometimes you need to say, it is not safe for me to be here. I have amazing tools. I have amazing toys for this sandbox. The sandbox is a lot of fun. I've got great toys. You guys have made it not fun. I'm going to go to a cooler sandbox. Sometimes that's the safest bet. So one of the first steps is to acknowledge and repair harm. I did a little bit of Googling today to see what's been going on at Berkeley. And there's this, I was really pleased to see that there's been there's a plan to rename a hall called Bolt Hall, where I'm sure many of you are more familiar with this than me, because I literally read one article on it. But this is a lawyer who had some very racist and troubling beliefs that were that were directly harmful to Asian, Black, and Native peoples. And that there's a goal not only to change the name of this hall, but again, in terms of acknowledging and repairing harm, producing some kind of way of remembering that history and trying to move towards change, right? This is a great example of trying to move towards change without just erasing harmful histories. Because we need to remember that many of the most elite institutions in this country were built with the labor of the enslaved. Those of us who are land-grant institutions, our lands were built on theft from Indigenous peoples. Many of our institutions are still inaccessible to those experiencing poverty. White women benefit more from affirmative action than any other group. There's a pretty good amount of literature on that. And, as with this example with Bolt Hall, our buildings and grounds are often filled with racist and sexist iconography and names. So to move towards repair and harm, we need brave communities. We need to focus on whole barrels, not rotten apples, right? So instead of saying, oh, we just need to pluck out the rotten apple through a nice reporting process, find them guilty and move on, we need to recognize the whole barrel is rotten, and what are we going to do about it? We need to get comfortable with nuance, decide together how to scale consequences, find leaders who are actually willing to make a sustained commitment and follow them and support them, right? Being a follower is actually a really important job. And then make sure that your values are aligned and that your actions follow from them. I know I'm running short on time, so I want to, I want to say this quote, and then I'll move on to the next slide and then be done. My thinking is still evolving here. I'm doing a lot of reading and listening in terms of how we actually move away from these compliance-based models towards one that is really about communities working together, and mutual aid is one way to start to think about and learn, as another way to learn from how to build solidarity and how to build community accountability. And so I just want to read from this one quote from Dean Spade's recent book about mutual aid, where he says, real change comes from movements made of millions of ordinary people, not small groups of paid professionals or people that you ask to come give a talk at your museum. We should be wary of solutions that, quote, replicate, legitimize, and stabilize that system. And all of the things that are policy changes are about legitimizing and stabilizing the university. That shouldn't be the goal. So what that means is, again, I'm trying to skip ahead because of time. So what I want to, no, I'm not even going to do it because we don't have time. So what I want to end with actually is just saying a little bit about the kinds of things that we could imagine in terms of a different future for how we change and how we try to eliminate sexual, racial, and other forms of harmful harassment in the workplace. And that's what it would take to actually address the things below the waterline. We need to normalize conversations around mistakes, misunderstandings, and moments of healthy conflict. We actually have, like, you don't have to do this all the time, right? Like, there's a lot of different narratives about numbers of spoons or bones day versus no bones day. Like, we don't all have to call in all the time. You don't have to be the accountability jerk every day. You don't have to gently talk to somebody about something they're doing wrong every day. But to the extent to which we can normalize that these are conversations that people who care about each other have with each other, we need to. We need to create more transparency and accountability across all the processes of our institutions, and think about community rather than victim responsibility. Because when the reporting process imagines the only person who has been harmed by sexual harassment to be the victim. But what we know is that sexual harassment harms entire communities. When we all know that our department is harboring someone who has been incredibly hostile and driven every single woman in the grad program out, right? That doesn't just harm those people who've left the grad program. It harms everybody who's sitting around feeling uncomfortable about it, feeling miserable about it, feeling powerless to do anything to change. Entire communities are affected, so we need to start thinking about entire community responses. Informal reporting, we have biased response teams now across multiple universities, including my own, that allow for sort of mediated conversations as opposed to we're going to report it and bring it up the chain and formalize it. And I think that that can really do a lot to address some of these below the waterline issues. We need more confidential counselors. None of us have enough mental health capacity in any of our institutions, nor do we have enough confidential people we can talk to like ombuds people. And that's a real problem and a real barrier. And then finally, we need to set some expectations of professional respect. What does it look like to show respect for one another? Because it's not just about tone. It's not just about whether you swear or not, right? There's other ways we need to define respect that don't end up tone policing certain groups of people who do need to speak truth to power. If you still don't think we need to completely overhaul the incentive structure of science, I want to leave you with one last point. 2 Supreme Court confirmation hearings during the Trump administration are burned into many of our brains, Barrett and Kavanaugh, especially today with everything happening with the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade. Amy Coney Barrett's nomination and confirmation could be seen as a victory for women, right? If you think that diversity, that is counting heads, is how you solve gender problems. But counting heads and getting one more white woman into the Supreme Court means nothing if you harm scores, if not hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions at this point, with what we're looking at today, of people in your wake. Moving from diversity to inclusion, inclusion to equity, and finally from equity to justice, in the words of D.L. Stewart, is how you measure victory. No matter your politics, that appointment did not occur through just means, which has brought to mind for many women the equally unjust confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, despite a credible account of sexual assault from Dr. Christine Blasey Ford only a few years before. Dr. Blasey Ford knew coming forward was dangerous, and she said, quote, and this is from her in her hearing, "I was calculating daily the risk or benefit for me of coming forward and wondering whether I would just be jumping in front of a train that was headed to where it was headed anyway, and that I would just be personally annihilated." When are we going to stop using a system that annihilates people when they come forward? When are we going to look at what we are doing to people who have been harmed by harassment or assault and say, let me do this for you? We need to ask ourselves what it would look like to stop borrowing from the criminal justice system and start demanding better of each other. To my mind, this means that the best way to honor Dr. Blasey Ford and the many other people who have stepped in front of moving trains on our behalf is to recognize that no one stops a train this way. It's time to create more space for healing and growth and less space for harm, more space for prevention and less for adjudication, more for justice and less for risk mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. If we could unmute yourselves, please, to give a round of applause. Thank you very much for what I found to be enlightening and really motivating and moving talk. I'll open up. I know people may have to head out, but for those of you who have a minute and would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself, or you could put it in the chat.
I swear I tried to cut it down, but then I also added stuff. And I do that every time. I will never learn. I swear I will never learn.
No, it was really good. It was worth the time. Okay, I can start us off. I mean, a couple things stand out for me, what you talked about. One is the unwritten rules, which I think occur at every single level, and they are things that we talk about, sometimes not necessarily openly. You know, do you have any thoughts on that? And the other thing I was thinking about is your comment about conflict management, which I find also to be, you know, it's extremely important, but I feel that it's also kind of baked into how we were raised, and it's a very complex topic. So I'd appreciate any further thoughts on those.
No, those are both great. Those are both great things to start on. So just to the unwritten rules piece, you know, the solution to a lot of that is transparency and accountability, right? There are a lot of ways where I was just having a conversation with some colleagues about this recently, where we need to do, you know, something we've been thinking about in our program is we want to do better by our grad students and create more specific expectations for mentoring so that faculty have clear guidance on what they really should be doing. And that we are feeling sort of stuck, very similar to the talk I just gave, we're feeling very stuck in only imagining policy solutions. Because we're like, well, we can require committee meetings every year. We can require that the prelim committee be formed earlier. We can require this, require that. And the part of the conversation was like, we can get people to meet those expectations. That won't necessarily, if you'll excuse my language, but like I said, I swear a lot, that does not actually necessarily prevent shitty behavior, right? It doesn't necessarily prevent abuses. It stops the like inadvertent benign neglect, right? And I think that's great. That's great to work on that, but it's not going to really fully address some of our other issues. And we're still sort of thinking about what to do. And I really do think part of it is actually starting to talk about it. It sounds so silly. It sounds very glorious. Well, it's not silly, but like it sounds very Gloria Steinem or second wave feminism, right? But raising consciousness is actually part of the solution. Until we start to have very explicit conversations about what are the kinds of conversations that happen during tenure and promotion reviews. What are the kinds of conversations that are happening in hiring committees? I think it's going to be hard for us. We need to expose the unwritten rules in order to actually try to change them, which means having, you know, it means people daring to have those conversations within their departments and within their professional societies, because departments are the ones that are responsible for hiring, right? At least those of us thinking, at least me thinking in an academic way in typical university settings. And yet professional societies do a lot to set disciplinary boundaries and expectations. So both of those places need to work together to think not just about hiring practices and workplace practices, but disciplinary expectations in order to sort of expose them. To just briefly address the conflict piece, that's also a major issue. And of course, many of us in these really, you know, we're all from different geographic locations, different countries, different lived experiences in these university settings. We all come to it with really different lived experiences about appropriate ways to manage conflict. And what that often means is that you end up with people with really avoidant things. You know, I've had, for instance, you know, a grad student who's got feelings about something, so then they just disappear for months. Many of us have had that experience. Or like I said, with like, you know, avoiding networking opportunities at work, you know, people who just decide, or like I decided for many years for a particular organization to just not be involved. I just, even though it professionally harmed me, and probably I missed hundreds of thousands of dollars by doing it, I, you know, refused to be involved in something. And, you know, I paid a consequence for it by being avoidant instead of maybe figuring out how to take it on. And so You know, I think I have some folks here who do restorative justice work who have taught me a lot about how to step towards conflict and engage in healthy conflict. And I really think that this is a trainable thing more than anything, and that we do have some common ways that we can choose to identify each other's needs and speak compassionately towards each other when we have conflict. I actually really believe that across many different lived experiences and cultural backgrounds, that that's a very possible thing, and power differentials, but only if people with power are willing to make their number one priority when interacting with people with less power, protecting them from that power. And again, this is sort of stuff that I've learned from people who know how to do this stuff. I am not myself somebody who is a restorative justice facilitator.
Thank you. I think we could take one or two more questions. I'm sorry we're going over, but I think it's worth, you know, for this you can hang around. Valeria?
Yeah, and thank you, Kate, very much for the talk. I wanted to ask you about how, like a little bit about the behaviors and the emotions that are kind of awarded in academy and how they are like very male. And it's kind of a conflict for me as a researcher to be at the same time competitive and individualistic and at the same time knowing that I don't want to really commit to that type of frame.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think could be the future for academic in that way, like for academia? Like, can we change that, or I don't know?
You know, I'm going to allow myself to be super vulnerable and honest right now and say this is probably the greatest career challenge of my life. And I'm saying this as a cisgender white woman with tenure. So with all the privileges that come with those identities, and that's still the number one problem that I'm figuring out how to navigate, I don't have great answers. And my challenge has been that I have done very risky research that I'm very proud of, but very risky research since before I had tenure. And making those choices has made me, I think, less competitive for certain grants. It has made me less, I have not really done the minimal publishable unit thing. So I don't have a ginormous H-index. I don't have a ginormous number of publications. I've made different decisions about protecting the humanity of my students and not overdoing it in terms of trying to get pubs out fast. And I still got tenure. So I think there is a way to be that person, but I am now really hitting the limit. I tried to go up for full last year and I was denied the opportunity to go up mainly because of the quantitative measures. I am now going up and it's fine. So like there's a good end to it and everything. And I'm fairly confident that my promotion will go through this year and all that jazz. I say it to say, I'm sort of realizing the ways in which I've outgrown where I am professionally. And I'm sorry to make this about me, but I feel like it's a useful example, that I've outgrown certain things professionally. And yet I've seen that by deciding to do the kinds of things that I've done and being the accountability jerk that I am, that it's closed a lot of doors. Now, would I change any of it? No, I have the coolest lab group. The people that I work with are the most extraordinary, brilliant people I could ever imagine working with. I am the proudest, like, I'm sorry to make this about like parenting, but like the proudest lab mama ever. Like I've got brilliant students. I love them so much. Everybody I teach, I'm so proud to know them. My collaborators, I now have like one of the richest sets of collaborators I can imagine. So will I have the kind of success that my husband has had where he's on 7 R01s right now, and is a 6'4" white man? No, I never will. But have I carved out my place that if I need to burn this place down, I don't mean really, I mean figuratively, that I could, and I could protect my people and we could figure out how to make a better place? Yeah, I could do that. Genevieve.
I'll try and make it a quick question. Again, thanks for this super awesome presentation. I was wondering if you mentioned some of the steps going forwards, like normalize conversations around mistakes and misunderstandings and set expectations of professional respect. Do you have any resources or trainings, or have you used anything to try and build that, like, emotional intelligence, I guess, among like coworkers, because I've identified it by myself of like, this is what would be helpful in these people, but there's not really those resources without being like, let's all go to therapy.
Right.
So yeah, I'd love to hear if you have any.
Yes, everybody go to therapy. But also, so there are different ways to do it. There's a couple of things. One is, and I have a training that I do, but the institution won't give me any more money, so I run out of money, so I can't keep doing these trainings. But I used to run for 2 years an inclusive lab leaders program for grad students and postdocs, as well as for faculty, that we secretly called anti-asshole training, because that was the whole point of it. It was to help people learn how to not be assholes to each other. And I'll tell you just the short version of one of the things we do, which is we do a values and expectation exercise. I also do this in my classroom at the beginning of every single semester. Students who take multiple classes with me, they just have to put up with doing it again, is we discuss what our values are. We discuss the kinds of expectations we should have of appropriate conduct towards each other. And we discuss consequences, like what happens when. So what happens when a student stops showing up to class? What should we do? Well, seeing as I don't have an attendance policy, I'm not gonna like penalize them, but am I going to reach out to them and say, hey, are you okay? Sure, that's what everyone agrees on. So that's what I'm gonna do. If one person is being a jerk to another person, how are we going to handle that? We discuss it at the beginning of every class, at the beginning of every semester. And I create a document based off of that specific conversation, and I put it into our course management system. So you can do that for your lab. You can do that for your classroom, right? An example that I like of a way to do it is in Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead. It's a great book, actually. I don't know if you all are Brene Brown lovers or haters, but the Dare to Lead book in particular, I find as a scientist, a very, very helpful one. And I think there's a lot of very good examples of how to do exactly what you're asking in that book.
Thank you so much, Kate. We'll wrap it up due to time, if that's okay. I put a link to your talk tomorrow, so I encourage everyone to also come tomorrow to learn about menstruation. And I put a link also into the book that you're just mentioning. And Michael, did you want to say something? You're unmuted.
No, just thank you very much. That was wonderful to hear about. I actually have a lot of questions, but I think in the interest of time, we should end here. But we really appreciate you taking the time to do this both today and tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you.
And here's my email. And my Twitter, if that would be helpful as well, as ways that you can engage me if people want to follow up at all.
Thank you, Kate. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right, thanks everyone.